We recently did some work on planning and where we are on the adoption of planning processes. And I asked companies to participate with us in this effort. Yone is the Vice President of Planning and Logistics at Land O'Lakes. And Land O'Lakes is a co-op. It's really there for the farmers. It's a very different model, but I think Yone's done a great job of building a planning team. And Andrew comes from Procter & Gamble, probably the largest planning organization I know of, Andrew, in the world. Procter & Gamble is over $80 billion. And so what we want to talk about is where are we on planning and what does planning mean? And so let's start. How did you define planning and what does planning mean for your organization? Andrew, you want to go?
Sure. In a supply chain sense, we've got business requirements, we've got customer requirements, and our supply planning, or planning for the supply network, is really about translating that into what are we specifically going to do to execute, and having instructions that orchestrate everyone's work, materials through to production, through to distribution, through to delivery. But it's a plan, and it makes sure everyone's on the same page so that when something changes, we can change everything. And we like to say, it's that old cliche, you plan your work and then you work your plan. And we deviate from the plan when business conditions change.
Yone, how about yourself? How did you define planning?
I think planning is a fairly generic thing. So for us, it's very similar. We look at it as all the processes that are required. That basically says to get the right product to the right place at the right time. So all those processes that need to come together, whether they're orchestrated or integrated, that's how we define planning.
So the planning benchmarking started with quantitative surveys of 450 planners across a number of organizations. We also took financial analysis and looked at orbit charts on the evolution of planning, and we did qualitative interviews of the leaders. And we combined the information together, and the people that participated will get a document that gives their results. But what did I learn? And then I'm going to ask my esteemed panel to say what they learned. I grew up that, we had a tight correlation between forecasting and inventory. I did not find it in this study. In fact, I found that the company that was the best at inventory management was actually the worst at forecasting. I also found that we are not doing a good job on management of demand, and that forecast consensus is eroding the forecast in 4 out of 5 companies, and that lag 3 and lag 4 was more accurate than lag 1 because of management overrides and the lack of control of what we call consensus forecasting. I also found that alignment between demand and supply planners is larger at the larger companies, and that that's a big gap to close. And that forecast error at the DC level is very, very high, and that it's an opportunity for us. And more importantly, I found that planning processes are evolving. We're still very, very young in planning. So one of the things we looked at is how many planners do we have? And I don't know, Andrew or Yone, if you want to comment on this, because I know you had a goal about planning productivity. Any comments about this?
In general, it shows a very wide spectrum, right?
Yes.
There's some companies that are off the charts. For us, it was more confirmatory, where we fit in a relative pack.
Mm-hmm. Yone, any thoughts?
I think it's a very similar kind of thing. It's all over the board, and as we start to talk about one of the things we learned, so at the end, I'll put this in more context.
Okay, all right. And so if we think about this, we had 450 planners. We also were able to connect this with the qualitative interviews. These are the nodes. These were the companies and the divisions that we studied. And we first wanted to understand the effectiveness of inventory decisions. And the planners that believed that they were the best at inventory are also not the best at demand planning. And this is a box and whisker graph. So the way you look at it is the black line shows you the range, the blue circle shows you the mean, and the bands are the third and second quartile, show you some indication of variation. So the nodes here are correlated at a 90% confidence level to see who is doing better than the other at inventory decision making. Now, one of the interesting things I found was that many people had deployed inventory tools but had not actually designed an inventory planning role. The other thing I found was that there was a lack of understanding of inventory by management teams. We also looked at S&OP feasibility, and S&OP is not as far along as some of the planning, but one of the issues that many of the companies struggled with is having a feasible plan for S&OP. So you can see the further out, we have more random variability. We also looked at forecast error, and this was across the 2014 time period, and you see some variability. We also see some bias. One of the interesting things that I found was that forecast value add, or the ability to have a better forecast versus the naive forecast, was something that was an opportunity for most of the companies in the data, and the bias is pretty high. So what did you learn, Andrew, from the analysis?
You know, it's kind of funny. It was polarizing. On some ends, the actionability, sink your teeth into the learnings and what can we do differently, we didn't come up with a ton. All right, and I don't mean to be dismissive about this because we loved this work. You filled a void, Laura, Supply Chain Insights. My deep-seated fear was I'd have a consultant whisper into a leader's ear that you don't benchmark well in planning, and I had no way to disprove it or do something. So we didn't get a ton of actionable learnings. The companies in the study were from very different industries. We found that we used common terms to mean different things.
Yes.
We found that the structure of organizations was very different. So for example, in round numbers, we might have 5,000 planners. The overwhelming majority are hourly technicians, and in some other companies, they were talking managers.
Right.
Okay, so some of the survey questions were subjective, and our hourly technicians are going to answer differently maybe than seasoned managers, right? But it was, the other thing I learned is you can never connect enough with people who do similar work that you do in other companies, other industries, because you just get ideas. It was a really rich discussion.
Yep.
What I found.
Good. Thanks, Johnny.
Yes, for us, this was, it kind of reinforced what we have been living for the last 6 years. As Laura knows, I've been there 6 years. For those who don't know Land O'Lakes, everybody thinks the Land O'Lakes is this butter company, or butter and cheese, right? It's a dairy company. But we also have two very different other businesses. One is a Purina animal nutrition business, so we do animal feed for everything except basically dogs and cats. And then we also do crop protection and seeds for farmers. So we basically supply the entire supply chain all the way from putting the seeds in the ground to basically milking the cows kind of perspective. I mean, each one of those has a very unique component of it. For example, in our dairy supply chain, we're co-op. So the milk that comes in, we can't tell our supplier we don't want any more because the suppliers own us. And so we always have to figure out what to do with milk. Right? On our feed supply chain, it's quite the opposite. Most of the ingredients we use are byproducts of something else. For example, there are wheat hulls that we might use. Right? And so if nobody is using a lot of wheat, we don't get as many hulls as we need, so we got to figure out how do we make animal feed without it with another product. They're also very commodity type products. So the person from Scandin talks about prices going down or prices going up. We have that in our ingredients and in our finished items. Right? And so for us, what this work really did is we started to compare ourselves to other organizations or benchmark. It said that no two supply chains are alike, and it's really hard to benchmark yourself against someone else. You're better off benchmarking yourself against your progress, is what it comes down to. Because as I sit here, Andrew's supply chain is very different than mine, and to say that he has the right amount of planners, I have the right amount of planners, there's no answer to that, because his business is very different than mine.
So what's your advice for the people in the room? Andrew, as we think about the planning journey and how we grow the ability to plan in an organization, what's your advice?
We work so hard every day. It's really difficult to just get time to stop and think. What I got out of this was just how refreshing it was to talk to other people who do similar work, find out how they're thinking about it, see if there might be some leads or ideas that we could apply or just get smarter on the industry overall. The second thing I would say is, I know that I read the literature on our table, you're starting to think about round two. I know that in our company, our leaders looked at this and said, well, it may not be perfect, why should we get involved? And, like some of the questions are subjective or the terms are different or whatever. I'd say that term from yesterday, it was a very scrappy benchmarking and worth the time investment. The other advice I would have is, round numbers, we probably put in about 50 hours on the survey. We had 29 responses, and about 65–70% of it was a program manager role. Like, our frontline planners don't use terms like SAP instances. We would just lose them if we didn't translate it. And you really do need, if you're going to get involved, you do need some program management to translate it into language that's useful for the people filling out the surveys, and to get the real value out of it.
Okay, Yone, what advice do you have?
I think I have just two pieces of advice. The first one is, as Andrew said, if you have the opportunity to get involved in phase 2 of this, to each one of you, to get involved, because once again, the learnings that we got out of it is not about how we benchmark. It was about being able to talk to Andrew and other people that have, we had General Mills, we had a person from Shell, who in our case is very similar to our milk business in that the product never stops coming in and they got to figure out what to do with it. So it was the ability to talk to other people. You're going to find the one or two other organizations that are similar to you. They're not going to be the same, they're going to be similar.
Or parts of those organizations, right?
Right, and that you'll be able to talk to them about what did they do and how did they do it. The other piece of advice that I would say is never underestimate our ability or inability to get talented people. One of the things that came out of this is that the supply chain, whether it's in planning or anywhere else, we got to find a way to get more talented people into the supply chain. It's one of those areas where people say, well, I went into supply chain because I didn't go into something else, right? That's kind of the way it works out. And we really need this to be, if you think about all the presentations we had about what's happening with the mega cities and everything else, this is where all the creativity is going to happen. And we have to convince young people that this is where they want to be. And that's one of the things that we've been focusing on as an organization. How do we convince people this is where they want to be and this is where they want a career?
Our new form of the creative class.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your insight, and we will be doing this in 2015, and we look forward to sharing the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you.